we're going to think about how can pedagogies support our practice in the current moment in which we are. What does the world need more of in 2026? I think we all know what we need less of. We know as a collective of feminists what we need less of. Let's have a look as the answers come in. Feminist justice, critical thinking, equality, peace, justice. So we have some quite clear positive messages there. I think it's really important in the current moment to not be losing hope, know that things are difficult, we know we're in challenging times, but I think as a community of feminist practitioners, it's more important than ever that we come together to reflect on how are we going to deal with this transition, this revealing, because lots of the things that I'm reading are really suggesting that yes, this is a crisis, it is a transition, but it's also a great revealing. It is becoming clearer the power of the patriarchy, the power of racism, the power of capitalism. So these are things that we as feminists know. What can we do right now? What do we need more of? So justice is interestingly the one right up in the middle. So that's the biggest one so far. Based on these reflections, I'd like us to start thinking about feminist pedagogical principles, what that means in terms of our work as feminists, and how we can apply it. Most of us at some point do training or some form of facilitating, and we also are always engaged in conversations and discussions, and many of us work in institutions where we're working on structural change, policy change. Many of you will be activists working with different groups and different stakeholders. So whatever our feminist work, I believe that feminist pedagogical principles can help us to move forward in moving towards some of these. Our mission is to create and nurture a network of gender specialists with a shared purpose and common methodology. And our vision is to provide a home for everywhere. So you are welcome, whether you have been working with us before or whether you're new to Fabulous Feminists, you're very welcome here. What do we mean when we talk about feminist pedagogical principles? I say here intersectional feminist pedagogies because we are working with gender as an issue, but we also want to work in an explicitly political way that acknowledges colonialism, racism, and engages with various aspects of our praxis that enable us to really address some of the intersecting privileges and discrimination that we face when we're working in environments on gender equality. So the first one, participatory horizontal experiential learning. Second, engagement with personal and lived experience. Third, focus on impact, results and change. And fourth, critical thinking and reflexive learning. Let's start with participatory horizontal experiential learning. What does this mean and how do we do this? As feminist trainers, what kind of a learning environment do we want to construct? This should be horizontal to start with. What does that mean? It means that as facilitators, as trainers, we are both educators and learners at the same time. This is important because it decenters traditional power relations in the learning environment and allows us to really create and question some of the power dynamics that come into training scenarios. So we come in with authority. It's important that we have authority, but at the same time, we are also creating a horizontal learning environment. We're not coming with all of the answers by any means. We're coming to also learn. So we can set up that kind of environment. And I actually think that that can be helpful for us in our current times because we're not just coming with all of the answers already to the gender equality issues. We are coming to the table as learners. We want to learn from other perspectives and understand better how we can develop this horizontal and participatory kind of learning. So we do this in a feminist classroom, which is, to use Bell Hook's term, a feminist classroom. And I think that this is an interesting construct, particularly now that we work online. So what does a feminist online classroom look like? A feminist classroom should be collaborative, experiential, egalitarian, interactive, empowering, relational and affective. So quite challenging amount of what we would like to do with our feminist classroom. So I invite you to have a little think yourself now. Just take a moment and think about, have you ever been in a feminist classroom? And have you ever taught in a feminist classroom? And what do you think that would look like? Why is this feminist classroom important? Because I think now more than ever, learning is not a luxury. We seriously need to find ways to continue learning and unlearning. We know there are many people who are very confident of themselves and very sure of themselves. So it's important for us that we continue to construct ways of learning that challenge the dominant power structures and challenge that claims to know. Also, feminist pedagogies call for sensitivity to gender, race, class, sexuality, disability, multiculturalism, post-colonial criticism, and globalization. So we really want to make sure that while we're focusing on from a feminist perspective, we are also taking into account many other dynamics of power and inequality within the global system and within the institutions in which we're working. Now, engagement with personal and lived experience. And I think that in the age of social media, we have many claims to know, and we have problems with fake news and with truth and objectivity. So we have to be careful with this one here. How do we deal with personal experience as a legitimate source of knowledge? We encourage our participants, our colleagues, to reflect on and share their own experiences of intersecting inequalities and privileges. For example, when you're working on privilege within organizations, some of us will work with more marginalized groups and some of us work with more privileged groups. So I can see that we have colleagues here from the UN, we have development practitioners, we have those working on NGOs and women's rights, for example. Sometimes some of us work with the least privileged, but many of us work with the most privileged. I, for example, run gender responsive leadership programs for the UN. I work with those working at the highest levels in the UN. So in those places, how can we encourage people to reflect on their own experiences of inequality and privilege? And sometimes by helping people to reflect themselves on the ways in which they may experience in some ways privilege and in other ways discrimination, rather than pointing the finger and saying, acknowledge your privilege, which we know doesn't work, we can actually use personal experience to draw these out and to have more meaningful conversations. Many of you will have been in a training scenario or a learning scenario where the personal experience of the participants may contrast with the overall aims of the training. For example, the sharing of sexist or racist opinions. So how do we deal with this? There's a couple of ways that we can deal with this. One is by calling it out. If they're outright racist or sexist, then we would expect to call it out, and we would also hope that someone else of our participants would call it out. What about if it's more subtle than that? For example, I'm sure that almost all of you have heard a senior woman say that she personally has never experienced gender-based discrimination, so she doesn't understand why this is necessary, why we're still talking about this, and why do we need to be in this training. This is a very interesting example of where the personal experiences of participants may contrast what we're actually trying to do with the training. And this is certainly one of the more grey areas of working on feminist pedagogies, but it's also what gives us an opportunity to play around with this. So we will find that many women say that they haven't experienced this. So how do we gauge and respect that particular lived experience, and yet at the same time try and work as a group, as a feminist classroom, to explore some of these power dimensions? So the third one, and I've been thinking more and more as this year has started, I think I've probably had 3 people already tell me that their learning budget for 2026 has been cut. This is not a surprise to anyone. Last year, many NGOs had to close, many feminist organizations had to close, and many international organizations cut their gender budget and their learning budget. So this is not new. However, we are definitely in a new time in terms of learning. In the spirit of trying to see the current moment as an opportunity and being positive about how we can approach this, what I think this means is that we can no longer afford bad quality training. We can no longer afford a training which is really a PowerPoint presentation for 2 hours. We can no longer afford training which doesn't have a clear goal, a clear aim, and which doesn't have any real ways to measure its impact. So whereas before there would be a proliferation of training and perhaps you had the opportunity to either run or attend a number of trainings, now there will be fewer training opportunities. We know this is clear. So for me, this makes it even more important that the learning and training that is being conducted is feminist and relies on feminist pedagogical principles and also can improve impact. It's not just about, so we presented this and everyone now understands the policy. We need to understand, how did that happen? How did they understand it? These are the kinds of questions that we will need to be asking ourselves as we move on 2026 and forwards. First of all, in order to be successful, gender training needs to be grounded in feminist politics and committed to social change. We can't just do a training or as a one-off and expect that to lead to some form of change. It isn't going to happen. I'm sure many of you have been in trainings which are ineffective and haven't really had a very clear understanding of what you were expected to learn and what you were expected to come away with and do afterwards. So how do we do this? I think that first of all, we need to make sure that when we're running feminist training or any kind of learning, it doesn't just have to be a long training experience, any learning or facilitation environment, that this is part of a broader commitment to social change. For example, there's an organisational policy on gender equality. There is a budgetary commitment. So this means that what we need to do is hold our training participants, our learners, accountable for gender equality. So they don't simply come to the training with their cameras off, check their emails, and then leave. This is up to us, really, to generate this accountability and make sure that it's completely embedded within what we're doing. How do we hold participants accountable? Let's say, for example, that we're talking about the human resources team of an NGO and we're doing a training on prevention of sexual harassment. What can we do with our learning to make sure that we encourage our learners to be accountable? So some examples include, for example, when I end a training, I always do a learning pathways document where every participant has to write down, what did you learn in this training? What will you do as a result of this training? And set out some clear objectives, and then how will you hold yourself to account for these actions? And I always do a follow-up session. The point of a follow-up session is that it really gives you the opportunity to be able to explore impact. Did this learning experience have any impact? And even by setting up a follow-up session and saying, we'll be meeting again and we'll be looking at how far you've managed to implement these actions that you committed to. So already making participants accountable to themselves, to each other, and to you as well as the trainer. In a follow-up session, you can really explore to what extent your learners were able to put into practice what you did together in the training. And it's really important that trainings are embedded in broader change processes. We're going to be asked more and more to demonstrate the impact, prove why your training was worth the money we spent, prove how this was actually meaningful for our participants, for our staff, for our personnel, for our stakeholders. So the onus there is on us as trainers to develop a good evaluation process, to have a follow-up session, to hold learners to account, but also we need to ensure that we also hold to account those who've commissioned the training. If we've been asked to do the training, we need to be clear that the training's only really going to have an impact if it's part of a broader change process. It's very important to ensure that we also hold those who are organising training to account and say, how do you plan to follow up on this? How will the participants be followed up? How will the learning be supported? Let's go now to our number 4. I think we can all think about this not just in terms of a training environment or even a learning environment. I think we are in a moment in time, in history, where we need more deep thinking, more slow thinking, more critical thinking, more feminist thinking. As feminist trainers, as feminist facilitators, and as feminist activists and practitioners, how can we do this? In our training environments, this means that we support our participants to engage critically with the topics and issues being discussed. This would mean, for example, making sure that there's enough time. We are often encouraged to squeeze in as much content as possible to trainings, and I'm concerned about this particularly now when learning budgets are lower. I'm particularly concerned that we're going to be asked to do it in one day. So first of all, I encourage you to push back against that. But secondly, really to make sure that you create space. Once you get participants to your training, you then give them an invitation to do some deep reflection. Last year, I was told several times by different colleagues and organizations, learning is a luxury. And I think this is a very dangerous way to think. I don't think learning is a luxury. I think it's absolutely essential. And if we consider learning to be a luxury, we are putting ourselves in a very dangerous situation. Rather than learning being a luxury, I think learning is essential to all of the things that we put in our opening, what we need more of. Justice, equality, peace. As trainers, how do we make sure we carve out this space and give our participants that opportunity to really explore the issues being discussed? Most bureaucratic institutions, public administrations, UN agencies, there's very little time spent on this deep reflection. And I'm really concerned that if we throw deep reflection out of the window, we say, no, we don't have time for we can't afford these, we can't afford 3 days of training. And I don't mean in terms of money, I mean in terms of time. How are we really going to make progress on gender equality if we don't give ourselves the space to think and learn? So my mission for this year is supporting feminists and those of us working in different organizations to hold space for these kinds of difficult conversations. We cultivate critical thinking and open-mindedness in our trainings and in our interactions with colleagues, and it means that we practice these ourselves. This is challenging because I think that many of us think that as trainers, we need to have the right answers and we need to know everything. Whereas I would encourage us to embrace not knowing, embrace complexity, and don't be frightened of complexity in training scenarios. As a trainer, it is not your job to know the answers. It's your job to create the environment in the room that helps your participants to really reflect on these issues themselves. So how do we also practice this deep reflection? I'll just say one more thing on critical thinking. Don't be scared of silence. So here's an example. I am doing this LinkedIn Live right now. I'm a very experienced trainer, but this is a new format for me. There's a delay, so you'll hear this a couple of minutes after I say it. I want to be interactive, yet at the same time, I need to think of a way to best practice my pedagogical principles within this format. One of the secrets for me is not to be scared of silence. In fact, one of the things we do in our How to Be a Gender Trainer program is just an exercise where each participant asks a question of the group and just sees how long they can hold the silence. It's not an easy thing to do, hold space for silence, but silence is usually a good thing. And if you've asked a good question, then you would hope for some silence. So allow silence, allow space, allow time for people to really engage with the questions that you're dealing with in the training. Because it's one thing for them to go away understanding the sexual harassment policy. It's one thing for your participants to go away having a really good practical understanding of gender analysis. But what we really need is a training that has enabled participants in community, in a co-constructed environment, to deeply reflect on the things that we're dealing with. And you can do this whether it's a short training on some kind of skills aspect, a short training on a new policy, or an in-depth training with lots and lots of content. I've moved on now to impact, results and change. Remember, I was highlighting why I think this is so important right now, because we're going to be really held to account for every single euro, every dollar, every pound we spend. We will need to be demonstrating how this is actually making a difference. I also think this isn't necessarily a bad thing. that we need to be more accountable for our work, that we need to deliver better quality and demonstrate real impact with the money that's being spent. So, what can we do to increase the impact of our work? So, how can this principle help us in our feminist practice? Finally, we have critical thinking and reflexive learning. I'm really having to practice my own advice here because I think you are 8 minutes behind me. I can't see you. I know there's 17 of you still hanging on, so thank you so much. I only have your comments, but your comments are coming in with that delay as well. So I'm just trusting that you are there, and I'm just accepting the silence as a part of this form of interaction. And I can see that you are thinking deeply and critically because you're engaging with the mentee and having some great answers, which I will share with you shortly. We have some really good reflections in here, and I'm going to start sharing those with you now. Here we have the first principle, participatory, horizontal, experiential learning. So how can we use this? How can this support your feminist practice? So people are more likely to remember and take action if they feel like they've come up with the answers themselves. Yet absolutely, experiential learning is really the only way that we can learn things. Obviously, everyone has different learning styles, but essentially, the only way that we learn things is through doing. So the more that we can apply an experiential learning approach, the more likely we are to have effective learning experiences. We all know how ineffective, really, a PowerPoint presentation full of data is in helping us to actually learn. So let's remember when we're preparing our own presentations, even if it's just a short piece of work that we're doing, what is the best way that you can encourage participants to come up with the answers themselves? Amplify the different commitment of different stakeholders exactly by having this participatory approach. I think this about staying focused is really important. In online learning environments, we need to keep people's attention. I heard from my dear colleague Leslie Groves Williams, in an online training, people need to move their fingers every 3 minutes or every 7 minutes. So let's say every 5 minutes, people need to do something because otherwise we just lose people. People get distracted. It's just part of modern life. But we need to keep people engaged, have a good sequence, encourage a participation, and hold participants to account to make positive change. Connecting with people and continue our learning journey along trainees so we can increment our impact to make the practice sustainable, anchoring the learnings better and building communities of trust. I really like that. This could help by ensuring that we develop different activities so that all participants, based on their learning styles, as I just mentioned before, can participate. So small group activities where there's peer learning. And also we need to understand the needs of participants more specifically. Engagement with personal and lived experience. So it encourages participation, knowledge sharing and interaction and leads to greater understanding of issues. It makes everything real. These are no longer abstract concepts. I really like this because I think that often when we work on gender, we know what we're talking about, right? I know what I mean when I say gender mainstreaming. I know what I mean when I say gender transformative. I know what I mean when I say gender analysis. But that doesn't mean that someone who's not a specialist in this area will understand exactly what I mean. So, this exactly right. Personal and lived experiences takes these concepts from the abstract into something that can be meaningful for us. So maybe it's an emotional application to our personal lives, but also just making it real within our work lives as well, providing examples that actually make sense to our participants. And by sharing personal experiences, we can identify that problems considered private, such as sexual harassment, domestic burdens, or workplace discrimination, are in fact structural problems. I really like this one. So it's really helping people to understand that what may feel to them or seem to them like individual issues actually helps us to tease out the ways in which these are structural, organizational, cultural, etc. Provides space to consider normative behavior, improves and anchors learning, and provides for care as well. Yeah, so we bring people's not only their intellectual needs, but also their bodily needs, their bodily experiences into the training and learning experience. Impact, results and change encourages people to think about their role. Return on investment for the training, super important as we're talking about. I think more and more when we pitch our trainings, we're going to need to say, and we hope that you will be able to demonstrate this and this outcome, for example. It's the only reason for the training emphasizing on a follow-up training so that impact can be tracked. And it does give responsibility to participants to make things happen. And you'd be surprised how many people come to these follow-up sessions because they really actually do want to demonstrate what they've done. And it just encourages people to take the action and be accountable for their learning. Means we move from theory to transformative action, ensuring that efforts make inequality visible. Yeah, great point. Thank you. Helps us keep sight on the bigger picture and our North Star, helps us to keep standards high and set the expectations of others, and stay away from box ticking exercises that are a waste of time. Yes, exactly. And I think that we can say we don't want to do a box ticking training. It's not meaningful. It's not going to be delivering any results. So it's a waste of time and it's a waste of resources. So we can be cleverer about the way in which we spend public money, the ways in which we use these learning scenarios to make the biggest chance for actual real change. And finally, for critical thinking and reflexive learning, why is this important? How can we apply this in our practice? So it involves examining structures, norms, and behaviours that perpetuate inequality. We can really think about how we encourage participants to reflect on their behaviours and the structures and norms around them. Introduce innovation and creativity. Yes, I really like this. Not something that we mentioned, but I think more and more, how can we integrate innovation and creativity into our trainings? For example, using play to get unstuck with certain issues. So that's an example of where we might use creativity to support this critical thinking. People aren't necessarily comfortable. And I think a lot of the time we do everything in the spoken way. So everything is focused on words, but not everyone works best, learns best like that. And also, usually, the majority of people are not doing the training in their first language. So they may be training in their second language or their third language, and they're not necessarily speaking in the language that is most comfortable for them to work in. I always try and think of ways that we can use creativity that allow people to engage in the learning without necessarily always being about talking. This point is great. Understand my own unconscious bias and those of participants. I think it's great as a trainer to examine our unconscious biases. We know that we need to look at these things, and just some time to reflect on these can help improve our practice. And language, for example, is one of those. I'm a native English speaker. That's a massive privilege. And it may be that during a training, I find it easier to engage with the participants who are also native speakers. That's a massive bias that could come into my training quite easily. So how do I mitigate that unconscious native English speaker bias, for example? What steps can I take to make sure that that doesn't impact on the quality of my training? It helps us to understand issues more deeply. And essentially, I think that's what we're talking about when we think about what we're going to do in this world going forwards. We want to try and understand issues more deeply. And how do we do that? Through innovation, through creativity, and through deep critical thinking. So thank you so much for all of these comments that have come through. Brilliant, all really interesting reflections. And I hope that you can really think about how you might apply this to your own work. So if you've liked what we've talked about today, then you're very welcome to join one of our trainings. We have a learning pathway for gender training. So this starts with level 1, which is Introduction to Gender Training, which is a self-paced course. That we have a free module for that. The first module on that is free, and it's very similar to what we've covered today in this session. And then you go on to look at the training cycle, at different types of training, and at the field of gender training. So that's a level 1 course with Fabulous Feminists. The next level is How to Be a Gender Trainer. This is a 5-day intensive course. It's similar discussions to what we've been having today, but of course completely interactive, and you'll learn the theory, and then you also design your own activity in pairs, and you deliver that to the rest of the peers. And we have a very constructive feminist feedback mechanism where you have the chance to learn, and we collectively reflect on how we're going to apply these principles in practice. So the last booking for that is next week, the 18th of February, because the following day is the first session, which is the preparatory session, where we will meet to discuss who other participants are, meet each other, and how the training will work. And then it's a 5-day course in the afternoons, European times, and mornings in the Americas from the 23rd to the 27th of February every day. And that's really putting into practice and really learning how to do these feminist pedagogical principles, whatever your area of work is. Thank you again for coming today. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or reflections.